Okay, let's dive into something really complex today. We're looking at a stack of sources you've brought in, all centered on Muammar Gaddafi.
And right off the bat, based on this material, you get this really striking contrast. It pushes past the simple, brutal dictator label you often heard.
Also,
Well, these sources frame him quite differently as, a deeply complex figure. Some even go so far as basically calling him a kind of uh, hero who fell because he challenged the global system.
a hero fallen for defying the global order.
Yeah.
That's a strong framing.
It is. And that's really what this deep dive is about, unpacking this specific source material. It digs into his life, but focuses heavily on the U.S. involvement in his downfall.
And it looks at potential reasons, doesn't it? Reasons that, according to these texts, go beyond the official story about humanitarian intervention.
Exactly. Think of it like we're following a specific trail laid out in these documents.
Hmm.
We'll go from his early life, his rise to power.
Through how his relationship with the U.S. changed over time.
Right. Then the crunch point in 2011, and crucially, the alleged motives these sources suggest were behind the U.S. actions.
And finally, the aftermath in Libya, as described in this material.
Yeah, the chaos that followed.
Look.
It's all laid out here.
Okay, so everyone listening, get ready. We're exploring some specific claims, maybe some surprising angles, all drawn directly from the distinct perspective in these sources. Where does this account start his story?
It goes right back to his beginnings. Born in Bedouin tent, the sources say 1942. So not exactly privileged.
Humble origins, and then the power grab.
Yes, the 1969 coup. He overthrew King Idris I, established the Libyan Arab Republic. Pretty dramatic shift.
And once in power, what did he do, according to this perspective? What's highlighted?
The sources make a big deal about him nationalizing the oil industry almost immediately.
Taking control of the country's main resource.
Precisely. And that this is really central to their argument. They claim he plowed those oil profits back into the country, into huge social programs.
Like what specifically?
Things like free education, free health care, massive infrastructure. They mention the Great Man-Made River Project specifically.
And there's a claim about development levels.
Yeah, the sources state that under him, Libya actually achieved one of Africa's highest human development indexes, which is, quite a thing to claim.
It definitely paints a picture of investment in the population, at least from this angle. What else was key to his vision, according to this material?
A really major theme is his push for African unity. He was a big proponent of the African Union, apparently.
Okay.
But the thing these sources really, really emphasize is his idea for a unified African currency, backed by gold. The gold dinar, he called it.
Right, the gold dinar. And this is where, according to these sources, he started to ruffle some serious international feathers.
That's exactly the argument presented here, that this specific vision, an economically independent Africa, potentially trading oil in gold dinars, not dollars, was seen as a major threat.
A threat to whom?
Primarily to Western financial interests, and particularly the U.S., and the dominance of the petrodollar system. That's the core claim in this material.
Interesting. Even though relations did shift over time, right? The sources touch on the 80s.
They do, yeah, briefly. Mentioning, when Gaddafi was definitely seen as an enemy supporting revolutionary groups, Reagan's mad dog comment gets referenced.
And the 1986 bombing?
Yes, they note the U.S. bombing of Tripoli, and tragically, that his adopted daughter was killed in that attack. A very tense period.
But then, fast forward post 9/11, and the sources describe a complete turnaround.
A really stark one. They say Gaddafi started offering intelligence cooperation to the U.S., publicly gave up WMD ambitions.
And even opened up Libya's oil fields to Western companies.
Right. And by 2006, according to these texts, full diplomatic relations with the U.S. were back on the table. Restored.
Okay, so here's the crucial point these sources seem to be making. Despite all that cooperation, they argue that this underlying dream he had, the gold-backed African currency, was still viewed by Western powers, or at least the financial powers described here, as fundamentally unacceptable.
Exactly. An intolerable threat to the established system is how they frame it. The idea being, even if he cooperated elsewhere, this financial ambition was just too dangerous to the status quo.
Which leads us directly into 2011 and the Arab Spring context.
Right. Protests are up in Libya, like elsewhere. But these sources emphasize how quickly the situation there was labeled internationally as a civil war.
A framing that paved the way for intervention.
That's the argument, that this framing provided the justification, the pretext, as the sources put it, for the NATO and U.S. military action.
Which started as a no-fly zone.
but quickly escalated, the sources say, into actively bombing Gaddafi's forces, siding with the rebels, all under this banner of a humanitarian mission.
And these sources name specific U.S. figures they see as key players.
They do. They point to Hillary Clinton, suggesting she was a major force within the State Department pushing for regime change, advocating for a hard line.
And Susan Rice.
As U.S. ambassador to the UN, she's portrayed here as playing a critical role in building the international case for military action.
And President Obama.
Ultimately, he authorized the NATO campaign. The sources describe him as being under a lot of political and international pressure to intervene.
But they also include that quote about him later regretting it.
Yes, they make a point of mentioning that he reportedly later called the Libya intervention the worst mistake of his presidency, which is quite an admission, if accurate.
And there's that specific, rather chilling anecdote the sources use regarding Secretary Clinton.
Yeah, the "we came, we saw, he died" comment, reportedly accompanied by laughter after Gaddafi was killed. These sources use that specific moment to illustrate what they see as a kind of cynical detachment in U.S. foreign policy aims.
So let's boil it down. According to this material, what were the alleged real gains for the U.S. in Gaddafi's fall, beyond the public justifications?
The sources list several concrete points. First, pretty straightforward, oil and economic control. Meaning, with Gaddafi out, U.S. and European oil companies could get better access, maybe better deals, for Libya's oil reserves. And, crucially, the threat of that gold dinar challenging the dollar. Gone. Western banks could breathe easier, they argue.
Okay, what else?
Second, they call it a geopolitical reset. The idea here is that Gaddafi's Libya, framed in these sources as relatively stable and independent, was kind of an anchor.
So taking him out wasn't just about Libya.
Not according to this perspective. It weakened a strong, independent voice in North Africa, weakened Africa's overall potential for economic autonomy, increased Western influence, and maybe even disrupted China's growing investments in the region.
And the third point ties back to the currency idea.
Absolutely. They frame it as silencing a financial revolution. This gold-backed currency idea, they insist, wasn't just a pipe dream. It was a direct challenge to the IMF, the World Bank.
And the U.S. dollar's dominance, especially in African trade.
Exactly. It had the potential, they argue, to fundamentally shift global financial power dynamics. And so it had to be stopped.
It's very clear these sources are building a strong counter-narrative. How do they sum up Gaddafi himself, then?
Well, they don't shy away from calling his rule authoritarian. They use terms like authoritarian tendencies. But they stress very forcefully that he never attacked the U.S. homeland or directly threatened the American people.
And they keep circling back to his domestic investments.
Yes, repeatedly. The free education, the healthcare, the water project presented as evidence that he genuinely invested Libya's wealth in his people, making it, by their account, one of Africa's wealthiest nations per capita at the time.
How about his international stance, beyond the currency?
He's described as a very vocal, consistent critic of Western imperialism throughout his rule, although they do also acknowledge his later attempts to mend fences, particularly with the U.S.
And there's another claim about extremism.
Yeah, they position him as having been a kind of bulwark against extremist groups, implying his removal actually opened the door for groups like ISIS later on.
Which brings us to the aftermath in Libya, as these sources describe it.
And the picture they paint is, well, it's bleak, utter chaos.
Not the democracy and stability that was promised.
The complete opposite, according to this material. They describe a fragmented country, torn apart by warring militias, plagued by constant foreign interference, just total state collapse.
And specific negative consequences they link directly to the intervention.
They list quite a few. The massive worsening of the refugee crisis across the Mediterranean.
The rise of ISIS affiliates finding space in Libya.
Yes, setting up strongholds in that power vacuum. And also a huge surge in human trafficking, with Libya becoming a major brutal transit route.
So looking at the end game, how did these sources want us to remember Gaddafi? What's their take on his legacy?
They argue strongly that, history tends to be written by the winners. They urge you, the listener, to look again at his life and death, using the information they're presenting, with maybe more clarity, less bias.
And their core perspective on him remains consistent.
Yes, that he dreamed of a free, united Africa outside of Western economic control.
Yeah.
That he did invest in his own people, whatever his flaws. And importantly, that he wasn't a direct threat to ordinary Americans.
And that final, powerful, concluding thought they offer.
It's quite something. They argue his death wasn't really about liberating Libya. It was, quote, an assassination of an idea,
The idea.
the idea of the global south, particularly Africa, rising independently, charting its own economic course without Western oversight or control.
And that very final description.
Yeah, they claim he wasn't ultimately a tyrant to his people, but more like their lion, a protector maybe, and that his death unleashed chaos, not freedom.
And they end with a quote attributed to him.
Yes, reportedly his last words, or close to it, I will die here as a martyr.
Wow, okay. So we've really journeyed through this specific set of source materials. We've traced their narrative of Gaddafi's rise, his complex dance with the U.S., the controversial 2011 intervention, the economic and geopolitical motives this material alleges.
And the absolutely devastating aftermath in Libya, all filtered through the distinct lens of these sources you shared with us.
And listening to this deep dive, exploring this particular perspective from your sources, it really underscores how layered global events can be.
Absolutely. And how historical figures get cast in wildly different lights depending on who's telling the story and, the stark consequences of interventions, as highlighted so strongly here.
So a final thought for you to mull over, based purely on the material we discussed today. Considering these starkly contrasting portrayals, the familiar mad dog versus this lion whose death was supposedly an assassination of an idea, and the claims about unspoken economic motives. What does this specific account make you think about who holds power on the world stage, and maybe more importantly, who gets to write the first draft of history? Something to definitely reflect on.